This episode is brought to you by Hired.com. Searching for a new job can feel stressful, scary, and time-consuming. Pushy recruiters try to sell you on roles that you don't actually want, and job boards make you feel like you're throwing your resume into a black hole, never to be seen again. Sometimes you go all the way through an interview process just to find out at the very end that the salary offer or company culture doesn't match what you're looking for. Hired is the world's most intelligent talent matching platform for full-time and contract opportunities in engineering, development, design, product management, data science, sales, and marketing. We make your job search faster, focused, and stress-free. Instead of endlessly applying to companies and hoping for the best, Hired puts you in control of when and how you connect with compelling new opportunities. After completing one simple application, top employers apply to hire you. On Hired, you receive personalized interview requests and upfront salary information so you can make informed decisions about which opportunities to pursue over a condensed timeline. Throughout the process, your dedicated talent advocate will have your back, providing unbiased career coaching to help you put your best foot forward with potential employers. Hired offers access to 4,000 plus innovative employers, including big brands such as Facebook and smaller emerging startups. The size and type of company you want to connect with is totally up to you. We help people find new opportunities in 17 major cities in North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Open to relocation? Let us know. Your privacy and autonomy in your job search is of utmost importance to us. That's why Hired hides your profile from your current and past employers. The best part is it's always free for you to find your next job on Hired, no exceptions. We pay you to get hired. Today's listeners can earn double our normal $1,000 hiring bonus by signing up with the show's link. That's right, earn $2,000 for finding your next chapter on Hired. Visit hired.com/reactnativeradio to learn more. This episode is brought to you by dailydrip.com. Daily Drip makes keeping up to date on programming skills easier. You already know how much time it takes to find good resources and learn new languages. What if the hard part of that was already done for you? Sign up for Daily Drip and pick a topic that you want to learn about. Want to learn React Native? How about Elm? Maybe you want to brush up on your CSS and HTML. Every weekday, you'll get a short video or reading delivered to you via email. The best part is it only takes 5 minutes a day. We have a special coupon code just for React Native Radio listeners. If you sign up using the coupon code RNRadio, all one word, you'll save $9 on your first month, which means you can try out the React Native topic for free. Don't forget to use the coupon code RNRadio to show support for our podcast. Make learning part of your daily routine with dailydrip.com. Hello and welcome to episode 47 of React Native Radio. Today on our panel we have Peter Pikarczyk.
Hey everybody.
Ali Najafizadeh.
Hello guys.
And I'm your host, Nader Dabit. So today on our show we have both Tom Coleman and Sashko Stubailo from the Meteor Apollo project. So Sashko, Tom, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yes, before we kind of go into Apollo and GraphQL, can you kind of give us an introduction of yourselves and how you got into programming?
Yeah, sure. I'll go first. I'm Tom. I guess I started programming, way back when, logo writer when I was a young teenager, but really just started doing it for real when I entered uni and decided I was interested in computer science and did that for a long time in a kind of mathsy way. And then eventually fell into the world of web dev and ultimately Meteor. And here we are now, Meteor and Apollo.
Yeah, and I'm Sashko. I started out programming. I think my friend was trying to get me into it in like middle school or something. He liked to do crazy projects and stuff. And since then, I did a bit of web development. Then I got into Rails a little bit, and I did computer science in college as well. That was really fun. And now I got particularly interested in making developer tools. That seemed like the most interesting part for me. So that's how I got to working at Meteor. And now I'm really excited about GraphQL. So I'm working on Apollo stuff.
Can you kind of tell us about Meteor in general and kind of how the progression went from Meteor into this new Apollo and GraphQL project?
Yeah. So Meteor, for those of you who don't know, is a full stack JavaScript framework. So it has a build tool. It has a data system. It has a UI framework, although now it integrates with React and Angular. And Apollo came out of thinking about how to generalize the ideas in Meteor's data system to a variety of frameworks and backends and frontends. And GraphQL seemed like it's the perfect data system that's totally decoupled from whatever backend language or database you're using and also your front-end technology. And so it seemed like the right technology to organize around for essentially improving the state of data loading for all kinds of different apps. And so now, instead of just focusing on JavaScript for full stack, there are servers for GraphQL for Ruby, for Go, for Python, etc. And on the client, we're working on clients for JavaScript, but also iOS and Android. So I think it's a great way to expand some of the ideas we've had into a variety of different platforms. And the GraphQL community has been really great, a great set of people to work with to get all those different platforms filled in and all those different ideas going.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think in the Meteor world, we had a really great system built on Mongo database, MongoDB, which is a sort of document store. And it worked really well when you're sort of dealing with one document at a time. But ultimately, it was quite limited when you need to do sort of relations between documents and joins. And that was always the pain point that I personally had when I was developing Meteor apps. So when we looked at, I guess, the version 2 of our data system, there was a strong emphasis on how we're going to get joins to make sense across the client-server divide. And what we kind of ended up looking at looked a lot like GraphQL. So it was quite I guess not a coincidence because it was solving the same problem, but GraphQL, which came out of Facebook, looked a lot like what we were going to devise on our own. And so we decided to just throw our weight in behind GraphQL.
It's interesting, like that around the time that GraphQL came out, there has been, quite a few people that I've talked to, and even at our own company, we were also working on something like this. So I wonder why, like, everybody seems to be like, we were all kind of thinking the same thing, and like, it kind of gravitated towards that standardized GraphQL idea. And now it's kind of, it just seemed like very interesting to see a lot of people facing these same issues and all kind of coming to a similar conclusion.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I guess it's not surprising in a way, but it is interesting that GraphQL existed at Facebook for such a long time before they open sourced it, and yet there doesn't really seem to have been anything else out there that's quite as simple to solve the same problem in that intervening time, given that it seems like, as we talk to people, that everyone had this same problem. It's kind of a strange thing.
I think there were a couple of different things, right? Like, for example, Firebase is a pretty good, I think, GraphQL analog, right? Like, it had a lot of similar concepts about like tree-shaped data, doing joins and stuff like that. But, it was really focused on real-time data, which was one thing. And the other thing was that it wasn't really like an open source standard. I think the biggest thing about GraphQL that I think got people so excited compared to, for example, Firebase or Falcor or Meteor is that it's just a description of how the data is supposed to work, but it doesn't lock you into a specific implementation. So it's not like you can compare, like Falcor is just like it's a JavaScript library. And so you can say like, well, how many bytes does it have? Like what caching features does it have? But GraphQL doesn't have any of those things. So you can always build a better GraphQL client or a better GraphQL server. And so you're not limited to like a certain set of features.
So speaking of like implementations and stuff, could I use Apollo with GraphQL or Relay or, even something like Falcor? Is there like a reason why I wouldn't want to do something like that?
So when we started out with Apollo as a concept, it was going to be something similar to that it was like an implementation of a thing. But the more we're working on it, the more we want the tools under the Apollo organization to be something that you can use with any GraphQL implementation. So you can use the Apollo client with any GraphQL server, for example, GraphQL Ruby or Graphene, and you can use all of our server stuff with any other client, like with Relay or with plain JavaScript, Fetch, or anything else, for example. So it's definitely not something that's coupled to the different parts. It's just different parts of GraphQL, and it's totally standard GraphQL, and we're trying to make the different parts of the implementation better and more convenient for people to use.
So, like, I guess before we kind of get too deep into some of this technical stuff, for people that are listening that maybe haven't used Apollo, like, what's the elevator pitch for Apollo? Like, when you guys built this thing, like, what was the main problem that you were trying to solve, and why are people that look at it wanting to use it, and why are people using it? Like what's the main draw and idea behind it?
I think at the end of the day, it's very simple. Today, we're making Apollo to make it easy for people to get all the benefits of GraphQL in their applications. So we simply just want it to be the best way to use GraphQL, regardless of what front end or what back end you're using. There's some tool that we provide that will help make your GraphQL experience better. And there's really nothing more to it than that. We think like the benefits that GraphQL brings are so great for people that we don't even have to do very much on top of that. It's just enabling people to take advantage of those benefits in the best way. That is what we're trying to do right now.
So if someone wanted to just kind of build their own GraphQL implementation, they would basically use Apollo in addition to that to kind of ease and make the transition easier to get into it?
It's kind of like, for example, Apollo Client is a JavaScript caching client for GraphQL, right? So if you were trying to say like, okay, I want to have a GraphQL client that does this certain set of things that I really want to do, the Apollo client is a great base to build on from that, right? So for example, we have like React Apollo is like a really popular way to use GraphQL data in your React application. And the integration there is quite simple because the Apollo client core does most of the work for you. So you can come in, you can say like, okay, I don't like the way that it does like optimistic UI, and I'm going to replace that part. And then you have essentially your own GraphQL client that does what you need, or you can integrate it with Polymer or Angular or Ember or any other framework that you like. And so the idea is like it implements the core stuff that's really useful, and then you can go from there to get what you need. And on the server, it's a lot more JavaScript focused. The server-side tools we're building are just thin layers around the JavaScript reference implementation that just make it easier to describe your schema or set up a server or something like that.
I think overall, the basic goal of at least the open source part of the Apollo project is just to make it easier, right? So wherever we see that things could be a little bit easier or better, there's a potential for an open source tool, then we're keen to jump in and do that. And our specialty, I suppose, is primarily JavaScript, given that we're a DevTools company that built a JavaScript framework. But it's not exclusively that. So for instance, we now have a client for iOS that we've been building just because there wasn't really a complete iOS client out there for GraphQL that people were commonly using. So we saw like a need for that. And so we invested a bunch of time in getting that going. And that's really the focus of Apollo, is just making it easier for people to get going, as Sashko said, especially in the open source world. It's about making your experience better.
So I guess with someone that is using React or React Native, would they be more interested in the client or the entire client and server Apollo Stack implementations? And I guess also what would someone need to do to kind of get started implementing this in their app?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if someone is using React or React Native, that doesn't speak necessarily to what they're doing on the server. So it's possible if they're using a node-based server, using Express or something like that, then it makes sense to use Apollo's GraphQL server to stand up a GraphQL endpoint. But if they're using Ruby, for instance, on the server, then we don't really have too much to say about that. And there's a great GraphQL Ruby implementation that would make sense to use. However, on the front end, if you're writing a React or a React Native app, then we think that the Apollo React Apollo package is really a great way to do it and works really well. So I would suggest that would be probably where they'd be looking into using the React Apollo client to wire that GraphQL data into their front end.
Yeah, and the idea there is we want to, if you just go to the homepage of Apollo client, you'll see that basically we wanted to make it super simple to take just a GraphQL query and kind of decorate your UI component with that query to get the data in there. And so it's very easy to get started. It's very intuitively just GraphQL, like the same thing that you type when you're just sending a query. But then it has all the features you need to start from that one query and expand to an entire complicated application with features like pagination and optimistic UI and caching and all that other stuff. And so that's kind of I think the client is the place where we're focusing the most of our time right now, because there's just so many different things people might want to be doing on the server. There's like many different languages and different styles of writing GraphQL schemas. And there's these back end of the service platforms like GraphQL and Scaffold. But on the client right now is where we think we can bring the most value to make that GraphQL experience really, really great, specifically for React, for example.
And the React integration of Apollo client is probably the most far along, I suppose you'd say. So the client that we put probably the most work in, although I think the Angular integration is of a similar quality. And so, yeah, it's really probably our flagship implementation, the React implementation. So you'll see all the features of Apollo Client there.
I have a question. I'm a REST guy. So I'm going to be kind of like a bad guy here. I'm trying to see what's the benefit of using a GraphQL for a small project. Couple of things is I tried to implement the GraphQL. I was successful to install it, but I had to do a lot of work. Like it's similar to kind of like a Flux. The idea is great, but then people are like, they basically give us the idea, but we had to do a lot of work to get it to work properly. And also, I was trying to implement some sort of like a security on top of GraphQL, but it becomes very hard for me to understand it. Like, for example, in a REST word, I can just basically say, as soon as it goes there, I know exactly what I want, and then I can basically apply the security rules on top of it. But in GraphQL word, because everything is going to be complex, like you can basically query very complex scenarios, applying the security would be kind of like a nightmare. I don't know. I've never actually done a security. I was trying it, but then I was kind of like a give up. So I was thinking, like, how would you guys solve the security issue in Apollo? Like, do you have some sort of like a tooling system that we can actually use, or we can actually take a look at it, if that makes sense?
So I think that gets really right to the heart of exactly what we've been thinking. And I mean, I think it seems like we've been working on GraphQL for a long time. It's been, I think, almost a year now that we've been working on this stuff. But I think it's exactly like what you said. It's like when Facebook released the description of Flux, there were a lot of really great ideas in there, but there weren't necessarily all the tools that you need to get it going. And I think that only really took off for people, and it really only became easy to understand once Redux came along and made it super easy to understand what was going on and gave you all the great developer tooling, and everyone kind of formed around that. And I think that's exactly where we're coming from. Is we think that GraphQL is this like incredible idea. Like it's something that I think has the potential to change completely how we write all kinds of apps. And I think it can make it really easy to write small apps, although it doesn't right now, like you said. And it makes it especially easy to write really large and complicated apps. And so on an abstract level, questions like that are exactly why we feel like we could bring a lot to the GraphQL ecosystem, is by identifying the pain points of what people have trouble with. For example, like that's a server-side concern with security. So that's not something we've really looked into because we're focusing on the client. But in the coming, months and years, we hope to have more and more answers for questions, like common questions that people come up with when they're like, why should I be using GraphQL? And like, how do I get around these things that I already know how to do in a different framework or a different way of doing stuff? So I think that's kind of like exactly what we're trying to work on, but security is not currently like one of those things.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay.
So speaking of Redux, could I use Redux or any one of these other Flux frameworks with Apollo? Is there any reason why I would want to do something like this?
Well, it's even better than that. So Apollo Client is built on top of Redux. So what that means is because basically everyone who's building React apps right now, or some really large percentage of people, are using Redux to manage their data. That was one of the things we were missing, is a way to integrate that with GraphQL. And that's actually where Apollo Client started from, was the idea that using Redux with GraphQL should be really powerful and intuitive. And so the way Apollo Client works is you can use it without thinking about Redux. So you just initialize the client and it just works. But you can also attach it to an existing Redux store. And then you get the benefit of being able to look at, for example, the Redux dev tools, and you can see exactly where your query results are coming in and how they're being recorded in the store alongside your client-side data. And it's really easy to use stuff like your Redux state as an input into your queries as well. So it's actually designed especially for people who like the insight into their app data that Redux gives you, and people that are already using Redux in their app. Apollo is like specifically designed to be easy to use with that.
Oh, that's so cool. I'm so glad that I asked that question.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah, I was just saying, like, we saw a billion questions on the internet that are like, how do I use Redux with GraphQL? And it's like kind of silly that there wasn't a first-class way to do that, because like everyone is using Redux and everyone wants to learn about GraphQL, and it's like they should go together because they're the two kind of most popular data-related things right now. So yeah, I'm really pumped about that.
So would you take the data that you get from GraphQL from Apollo and store it in like a reducer, or is it something completely different than that?
So you can put it in terms of like the vocabulary words, I guess, that Dan Abramov uses to talk about it. So in some sense, Apollo implements like all three of the things that you have in Redux. So it has the actions and the action creators that fire off queries and handle the asynchronous data. Then it also has the reducer that reduces that data into the store. And it also has a selector, which is your GraphQL query. So when you decorate your React component with a query, that basically handles all three of those steps of the process for you. So while you can see the data arrive in an action, you can see how the reducer puts it into the store for you, and you can see how the selector takes that out of the store and puts it into your component. You don't have to write any of the parts yourself, at least to start with. But then when you have more complicated needs, you can replace some of the parts of that system. So you could have some custom reducers to do different stuff based on queries or mutations, or you could write a different selector that reaches into the store in a different way. And so that's kind of like the way we were thinking about it, is that it's super easy to get started because it just kind of does everything for you. But because of the way it integrates with Redux, you can like reach into the process and do different stuff.
And one thing that's cool about the way the reducers and the selectors are written that maybe you wouldn't be immediately obvious is that we do use a normalized store behind the scenes. So when you get a bunch of like a whole tree, a GraphQL tree of results back from your server, it's not stored in the store directly in the shape that you get it from the server. Instead, it's broken up into the various subdocuments. And that means we can do cool stuff like caching. So if another query comes in or another query is called that needs the same data, we can serve it even if it's not the exact same query. Or if another query comes in and writes over the top of the results we already have, we can then inform the original component that, hey, your data has changed and you may want to redraw. So it's kind of a advanced use of Redux in that sense, because you'll see what's in the store is not necessarily what the user deals with. And so our selectors and our reducers are kind of complicated in that sense, but it's kind of cool as well.
One other question that I want to ask is, since we're talking about the Redux and the component, in my current job, I had to do a lot of server-side rendering. And I'm just wondering if I start using Apollo, do I have to do any configuration, or is already, I don't have to do anything if it goes into the server-side rendering, like it just basically do the normal stuff? Because if you start using a Redux, you have to tweak it a little bit. You have to basically wait for the queries basically being finished before you actually pass it into React stringifier to just convert it into the proper string so you can actually pass it down into the server. So I was just wondering if you guys thinking about server-side rendering as well, or it comes out of the box, or do I have to actually do any configurations?
Yeah, that's actually something that we have in the React integration of Apollo client. So there's a function in there called basically it just calls React servers render to string. But before doing that, it walks your component tree, figures out which queries you need to call, calls them, wait for the data to come back, and then renders to string. So in a sense, I guess you don't have to really do anything beyond write that one line of code that calls it. And in general, in my experience, you don't really need to change the way that you write your components. It should just all work out of the box. Although, like any isomorphic thing, there can be lots of caveats and stuff. But I haven't seen any problems with the Apollo client itself in that.
The one other cool thing I wanted to add to that, because all the data is actually stored in Redux, the way that you do server hydration is identical. You just store the contents of the Redux store, and then you put that back in on the client. And it also works with stuff like Redux persist and like some of these other libraries that help manage your Redux data. They kind of just work out of the box because it's kind of just regular Redux stuff.
And some users that generate the HTML on the server outside of Node, for instance, some Rails users also have been able to inject that hydrated data as well, which is really cool.
Cool. Thanks.
So I have a couple of questions. I know we've been talking a lot about React and Redux, but can you use this with like Angular or just vanilla JavaScript or Vue or anything like that? Number one. Number two, what were the technical difficulties implementing this entire thing as you began to write it? Like, was it harder, easier, or have you had any issues that were interesting that you want to talk about?
Yeah, so you can definitely use it with pretty much any JavaScript UI library. So it was built from the start to be a very like UI agnostic thing. In fact, for several months, the React integration was actually maintained by not us, by somebody else that was using it in production. So while we were also using it in production at that point in time, we didn't actually write any of the React integration until very recently, which is kind of cool. And then there's been community integrations that popped up for Angular, Angular 2, Ember, Polymer, I think maybe one other. Oh, Vue.js, right? That's one I've been missing. So the idea is as much of the logic as possible is concentrated inside the core library, which has essentially like component level concepts. And then in your UI library, you just say like, well, here's where you update the options. Here's where you get the results from an observable. And it's pretty cool like that. Although I don't know of anybody using it from JavaScript directly in production right now. That's totally something you could do. And we really want to release at some point a couple of examples that are like, here's how to use like a fancy GraphQL client like Apollo with jQuery, you know, like if you don't want to buy into React or like anything like that. Yeah. And on the other side, in terms of implementation difficulty, I would say the main part that I worked on was getting the GraphQL normalization and denormalization correct. So basically GraphQL is not that trivial of a language. There's all kinds of different features like fragments, directives, arguments. You can pass the arguments in the query or you can pass them as variables, for example. And for Apollo Client to work the way that it does, we kind of had to implement all of those features again on the client. And of particular interest to me was not requiring a special build system. So many other GraphQL clients require you to set up a particular build process to compile the queries into a different representation. And that's part of what made it hard to use some of those clients, like Relay, for example, with other UI libraries or other build setups that didn't use like Babel, for example. So basically, we had to implement a very portable and minimal GraphQL execution engine. And we actually have that as a separate package called GraphQL Anywhere. So if anybody else wants to build a GraphQL client, they don't have to reinvent that part. So that was the hardest part for me because we've spent like 7 months getting bugs from the community and fixing those to make sure that the GraphQL stuff on the client works exactly the same way that it does on the server, because there's no way, like every time you read a GraphQL result from Apollo client, it's actually being normalized and then denormalized again. So it's critical that it works the same way. And I don't know if Tom has something to add on the React side or anything like that.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking the most interesting thing that I've worked on at least recently was that server-side rendering stuff that I was speaking about a moment ago. And it can be quite... Basically, we had to re-implement React's, like a very simple version of React's rendering algorithm in order to take, like, I guess you would call it an element tree, which is basically like your app with some props, right? And walk it to figure out the queries that your app needs to run. And it's quite mind-bending at times, keeping track of exactly what React does during rendering. And to be honest, I'm not sure.
That sounds pretty serious.
If we've got it completely right, but it seems to work in our experience, and some of our production users seem to be happily using server-side rendering. But it's pretty fun as well.
So basically, you could solve the big server-side Redux issue by just using Apollo.
If your Redux client, like if your whatever asynchronous stuff you're doing in your Redux containers added a fetch data static method to the component, you could use our library. But we did want to kind of generalize it. It's not something that we've really pushed yet because no one's asked for it. But it does seem like a generic problem, which is to take a React tree and a way of saying, does this component need to do something asynchronously, and walking it and figuring out all of the asynchronous things that need to happen and then waiting for them all and then rendering it for real, or recursing, which is something else we do. in case you have queries that depend on other queries. And eventually, once you know all the asynchronous stuff is done, you render for real, and you know that your data is all already there. It's a pretty neat approach, and it seems to work, but it's not something that I've heard other libraries doing. Maybe it's not as easy in other situations.
I'm sorry, what is the big Redux server-side issue, Peter? Because I haven't had to deal with any server-side rendering yet. That's why I'm asking.
I don't know if it's I guess it's more of like a React router, universal issue. I had a few pains with server-side rendering this past week, but it wasn't like horrible. It's just like sifting through some of the issues. People were like, I can't get this working, but I don't think it's like a horrible thing. I just don't think it's as easy as some people may think it is.
Okay.
I mean, the generic issue that I think plagues any whatever your implementation is, if you have data involved, is that you don't want to server-side render just a loading page, right? However, React doesn't allow asynchronicity in like component will mount or whatever. So if you need to wait for something, you need to figure out what you're going to need to wait for before you try and render it, if that makes sense. Like React DOMs rendered a string on the server is going to render a loading page unless your Redux store is already populated, or in our case, your Apollo client store already has all the data in it. And so the general problem of saying for this given route, what do I need to load into my store to make that render properly is not necessarily an easy problem to solve, not for a library author anyway.
Well, yeah, that's what we did at Presley. We basically created a new project called Transact, and the reason was that is we wanted we are heavily dependent on a search engine. That's why we need to actually use the SSR, server-side rendering. And what we did is on top of each React component that we have a lot of fetch and then query. And then what we need to do is we need to tell the server somehow that you have to wait until the data is ready. So you can just basically, so that's the first issue. The second issue is once you render the entire data, you have to serialize and normalize the data. And then you have to basically put the current data, attach it to the page, send it to the client, and then store needs to actually load that data that it receives from the server, and then it needs to replicate the same thing. So the hard part was getting the normalization to work properly, between the back, a server side and the client side. And then second part was telling the server how long it needs to wait before pass it the whole thing into the stringifier of the React, because React stringifier doesn't actually wait. As soon as you pass the component into it, it just basically spit out the component. So you have to actually wait until all the components. So that's why we spent probably 3 months investigating a lot of things, and then we open sourced the Transact project that actually tells you can just basically put the annotations on top of your component, and you can tell that component that you have to wait until these actually fetched completely. So it's basically the whole process that we did. And then so far it works. We don't have any problem with that. But that's why I was actually asking you guys about this issue, because we spent a lot of time on this issue. And we switched from Redux completely to MobX because it was hard for the things that we wanted to do. And then it wasn't actually scaling as easy as we thought. I'm not complaining. I'm still using Redux, but I guess that's going to be another talk. But that's why I always ask the issue that you guys have. But yeah,
that sounds really interesting. We should probably have a closer look at what the two libraries are doing, because it sounds like some of the same problems are being solved there, and maybe we could share some code. But what I just wanted to add was that half of the problem that you described there of the normalization and all that is the great thing about using a library to manage data like Apollo, because obviously that's what Apollo does, right? Its job is purely that job, really, of normalizing and storing data in a consistent form and serializing and deserializing it. So that side of it Apollo is great for, and then the other side of figuring out what you need to render is obviously easier as well if you know. Figuring out what you need to fetch is obviously easier as well if you know ahead of time that it's going to be exactly, it's going to be a GraphQL query, and this is what it looks like. But yeah, it sounds like there are similar goals there, so we should compare notes.
Yeah, definitely.
So kind of what are you guys working on now as far as future plans, and what do you kind of want to introduce into the project over the near and far future, I guess?
I'm really, really excited about this because we only very recently got to the point where we're really comfortable with the set of features Apollo client has as a GraphQL client. So, we have high standards. So for us, server-side rendering was kind of included as a base level feature that we wanted to have before we were comfortable telling people to use it in production. And so we've reached that point now, and that's a really great place to be. And the next stuff we're working on is kind of sugar on top, you might say. So the first thing is working on performance. So benchmarking in our own apps. What can we do to squeeze out a little bit of extra performance here and there? Or if it's even a problem, I think it's particularly something that people might care about on really slow devices like mobile, like React Native might be running on some really old device. And in that case, we're not really sure yet, exactly what the characteristics will be. So that's one thing to focus on. And that's kind of one of the things standing between us and an Apollo client 1.0 release, you might say. The other thing is just stuff that is just things we've never really seen done before. One thing in particular I'm really excited about is having something like an Apollo DevTool plugin. So, there's the Redux DevTools, for example, which give you some insight into your Redux store. I think that's one of the most exciting parts about using Redux is that you can see exactly what's going on in your app. And because our Redux store and our actions are much more meaningful, right? We know exactly what actions Apollo is going to be firing and what they mean. We can build an experience on top of that will show you exactly what data from your server is cached, let you run GraphQL queries inside Chrome against your client store, tell you what queries are attached to which UI components and when they're rerunning and why and how optimistic UI is working. Because we have this kind of integrated solution that manages your store in a particular way, we think we can build some really great tooling that will help people understand even more about what their app is doing at any given time. And part of that is the structure of GraphQL. It's very easy to build tools like this with GraphQL. And the other part of it is just that we have this fully closed system essentially where we understand everything about the requests and the actions and the reducers and selectors and components and everything.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to mention that we're looking at in the larger Apollo context is investigating if there's ways to make it even easier to get started, especially on the server. It'd be great to have, at least for that first exposure to GraphQL, a way to just get something up and running really quickly, start building your front end and start playing around with what your schema might look like. Because we're big proponents of what we call GraphQL first application building, which is basically where you start with your schema, you figure out what your schema looks like. And once you've done that, you can start building your front end and your back end kind of in parallel. And so figuring out a way to make it really easy to stand up a schema and start playing with it and have a server that serves it, but without necessarily having to properly implement the server in a production way, could be really fruitful. So it's something we're investigating at the moment. I think it could be really cool.
So for anyone listening that might not be familiar enough with GraphQL in general, is this something that they can pick up and attach to their existing REST API database implementation, or does their backend need to kind of be rewritten to handle this type of technology?
GraphQL is definitely something that you can add on, both on the front end and the back end. So for instance, in the JavaScript world, in the Node world, if you're using Express, you can just add a new route, typically called /GraphQL, which will serve GraphQL queries. And you can continue to serve all your old same REST endpoints, and you may continue to do that indefinitely. There's no reason that you can't use REST and GraphQL side by side. And so on the server, your GraphQL resolvers, which are the functions that get called to figure out what the result of a query should be, they can go ahead and call any other function in your backend. Typically, they should be like pretty thin, and they should go straight to your model layer, where all the logic should live. So typically, your maybe a REST endpoint and a GraphQL resolver may look pretty similar, and they both just call out to a model somewhere with some arguments. They don't do a lot of logic. And then on the front end, you can definitely use GraphQL while continuing to do whatever it is that you were doing before to get data. So you could have, one part of your site which uses Apollo or Relay to fetch data and attach it to one sort of subtree of your React rendering tree, and the rest of your tree might use data that's been fetched into Redux via REST or whatever other mechanism you had for fetching data. And there's really absolutely no reason why you shouldn't do that. And in fact, that's what a lot of people do and do it very successfully. Our hope would be that slowly over time, more and more of your app would become GraphQL-y or Apollo-y. But of course, that's just going to depend on what makes sense for you and what works best.
So I guess you guys built your company around this technology, GraphQL. Where do you see that going in the future? Is it going to be one of those things that's like a game changer that 10 years from now we're going to be seeing it like basically ubiquitous? Or is it something that will be popular, but it won't be like the next mainstream way to get data? Like, where do you see GraphQL going, in the near future and in the far future?
I'm totally 100% sold on a conceptual level that it is 100%, I just said 100% twice. It is feasible for GraphQL to replace REST as the primary way people load data. I think the reason that we're working on a lot of these tools is because the experience is not quite there yet, right? People have been building tools to build REST APIs with for literally 10 years plus. And with GraphQL, it's only been open source for a year or a year and a half. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with Apollo, is fill in all the blanks for people that, some people say, building GraphQL API is too hard, or using on the client is too hard, or there's some special tooling you need. And we just want to make sure that all that stuff is in place, because when you compare it on a conceptual level, GraphQL has essentially only advantages over REST as far as we can tell, except for really crazy, maybe not crazy, but really special edge cases where it's reasonable to fall back to a more regular HTTP endpoint. All of the regular kind of fetching data, modifying data, public APIs stuff, I think it wouldn't be crazy if that was completely replaced by GraphQL in the next 10 years, for example.
I have two questions. Should be pretty simple, but I just want to know. The first one is, why did you guys decided to go with TypeScript as your main development tools? Why not just use Flow type instead? And my next question, I forgot it. But yeah, you can just ask. You can answer this question first, and then I'll ask you the second question that I had.
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is to remind people that we're using TypeScript to develop our libraries internally. If you go on GitHub and you look at the source code, it's written in TypeScript. But there's nothing about it that means you have to use TypeScript in the app that you're building with it. And in fact, we don't. We develop the libraries in TypeScript, and our production apps are implemented in ES 2015 with Babel. It all just came down to, at the time of when we were starting to develop the project, how easy it was to onboard somebody into a project. So we found that setting up the right tooling for Flow to have a good integration with your editor and stuff like that when we started out with the project was not as easy as with TypeScript. We didn't really have a serious need for any of the differences between the two are mostly, I think, in the edge cases of the type system. And so those weren't really a big deal for us because we're not writing that much code anyway. But setting up auto completion in your editor and stuff like that with TypeScript was very easy, because you can just set up Visual Studio Code and it just works out of the box. And I didn't find that experience to be the same with Flow. And so for our contributors, it's very important that they can just open an editor and have everything working without having to worry about setting stuff up.
Okay. I actually remember my second question. And if someone wants to learn GraphQL, right now the entire data is scattered around the internet. What's the best way to learn GraphQL, like for newbies such as me? So we can actually start using and implementing a GraphQL into our application. What's the best way to learn it? And then where should we actually looking at? I know that documentation on Facebook GraphQL page is pretty good, but in terms of but it requires a lot of time. Should we actually take a look at some tutorial? Do you recommend we should actually take a look? Something that we can actually go into the Apollo website, and then you guys have a dedicated sections for learning a GraphQL.
So currently, the tools we're building, it was most important for us to work with people who already understand GraphQL, because those are people who are most likely to be, for example, contributors to the library. So we started out specifically with the assumption that people already understand the benefits of GraphQL, for example, and some of the main concepts. We actually contributed to writing a pretty significant chunk of GraphQL.org because it was important for us that it's easier to learn about the concept. But once we're to a more stable state with the client and some of the server-side stuff that Tom was talking about, we envision spending a lot more time writing tutorials for people who are not yet familiar with GraphQL. So right now there are a few resources. There's a good number of tutorials that are just like in blog post form that are like, get started with GraphQL and React Native or whatever. So those could be a good place to start that just kind of get you off the ground. There's a lot of great example apps to look at. So a lot of our example apps, particularly the ones on the front page of our website that actually Tom wrote, I don't know why I'm talking about them, but Tom wrote some great examples for the front page of our website that are just like very basic hello world type stuff. And so if you look at that code, you can see like, here's where we're setting up the HTTP server. Here's where we're writing some resolvers. And here's like how the client loads that data. So I don't think there's anything that's like super easy yet that will teach you everything about the client and the server outside of like a bunch of blog posts. But it's something that would be really great to have for the community.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky thing about one of the biggest advantages of GraphQL, which is that you can use it with anything, is that consequently, chances are there's not going to be a tutorial that's written in exactly the right combination of technologies that you're interested in, right? Like if you want to write a React Native app that uses a Rails backend, you might just not find any specific tutorial about that, just because there might be one about React Native and JavaScript backend or about Rails with a Angular front end, but that's tricky. I don't really know if there's ever going to be a great solution to that problem beyond, sort of piecing together various tutorials and taking from them the bits that you need, unless someone figures out a way to build a tutorial generator. I have thought about that.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, if anyone wants to learn about React Native and GraphQL, I wrote a blog post a few months ago that goes over hooking up a server, creating a server with Express and Apollo, and then consuming it on the front end with React Native. It's probably the most basic thing in the world, but it's a very, very good introduction, I think, or at least it'll help you wrap your head around it. And then also on the website for Apollo, I did find some good resources there, a few, demo apps, like you said, and a few tutorials. So definitely check that out.
Yeah, and for React Native users, we do have an example on the front page. There's no sort of tutorial behind it, but if you literally just want to look at the simplest possible code to use Apollo with React Native, the best thing to do is to go to dev.apollodata.com and check out the React Native example, and there's like a link to a GitHub project.
So this is a project that's open source, so people can contribute to it. Like, what kind of people are like, how's the reaction been, I guess, so far, as far as people contributing and opening issues and stuff like that? And if someone wanted to take part in the open source of this project, what would they need to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been one of our main focuses is, we 100%, like, we're using this stuff in production and we need it for our own apps. But on a philosophical level, we think the project is going to be the best if there's a diverse range of viewpoints and like inputs from different backgrounds. So like we're really committed to helping contributors like get started and grow with the project. So a couple of places to get started. I think like the easiest place to contribute to any project is in the documentation. So the documentation is something that we really care about, and we'll basically accept any pull request too. So that's one thing. We also have a Slack channel, like a Slack team you can join from our website that has a contributing channel on it. So if you're looking for a way to get started contributing, you can just go to that channel and post a message. But in general, it's just the regular GitHub stuff. Like I would say the first step is to use the project, because then you can find out what can be improved, and then filing an issue or opening a pull request will work great. One thing we're trying to come up with is a process for people to submit designs for new features, because it's kind of hard to tell exactly whether a feature is a good idea or not without some explanation of the background. So that's one thing. And another thing is having a clearer way to recognize contributors. So we always try to thank people that contributed whenever we publish a blog post about a new feature or we give a talk about it or something. But we could do better there. But the reaction has been really awesome. Like I said, pretty much all of the UI integrations were built by the community. There's also stuff on the server that's being maintained by people who have come and picked it up after we got started on it. In total, there's been, I think, somewhere around 200 contributors so far to the various parts, which has been like incredibly awesome. And we hope to keep growing that, because I think like without a lot of different contributors, like it's not going to be a good project.
So I'm kind of curious about the company behind Apollo and the company behind Meteor. Like you guys have been around for a while, because Meteor has been around for a while. So can you kind of talk about like what that company does and what you guys do on a daily basis as far as like work other than open source? And I guess you guys, from what I understand, you kind of work on this stuff full time, but what do other people in your company do, and how do you guys monetize, some of the stuff that you all are doing there?
Yeah, so the company is called Meteor Development Group, or MDG, but obviously the company started with Meteor, and the sort of overarching, mission of the company is just to make development of apps easier, to bring it to more people and to make it quicker to develop, better things. And so Meteor was really like a full stack framework, or is a full stack framework that people use, to get apps going really quickly and build great apps that are sort of real time by default. And it achieves that by being a full stack JavaScript framework. And on the commercial side there, we have a product called Galaxy, which is a hosting service for Meteor. So you can take your Meteor app and deploy it to the cloud with one command, and it handles a lot of stuff for you, like rolling deploys and keeping track of what's going on, and various things like SSL and stuff as well. So that's, our commercialization product for Meteor. And then on the Apollo side, with apart from the open source stuff, we've just launched Optics, which is a schema/performance monitoring tool for GraphQL. So the idea there is to take your GraphQL server, instrument it, and then figure out which fields are being used and which fields are taking a long time to execute and which fields are quick, to sort of figure out where the performance bottlenecks are in your GraphQL service. And you can do all this cool stuff by looking at traces of queries and figuring out why this specific query was slow. Oh, was this resolver called at this particular point of the trace? And the response to that has been really great. We only just launched it a few weeks ago, so it's still in its very early stages, but we've already used it on our own products and improved the performance of our GraphQL endpoints quite a bit. So ultimately, Meteor or MDG's goal is to make development easier and to, where it makes sense, to do that via open source and to give that away, I suppose. And where it makes sense to provide a service to do that. So for things like hosting or for APM performance monitoring, to charge for that. And I think that there's a natural, it typically does make sense to do one or the other. And hopefully that will mean that the company can continue to create great open source stuff while still, making money and being able to be a company. And then I guess the other side of your question was, what do we do specifically? So I myself work on mostly open source stuff, both within Meteor and within Apollo. I did do a little bit of work on the Optics product, which specifically making it work with Rails. So you can instrument your Rails server using Apollo Optics. And in the past, I have worked on some of the front ends of our commercial products, but typically myself, I do open source stuff.
Yep. And my side, I've been doing open source stuff pretty much my whole time at the company. So I think it's kind of cool because a lot of the open source stuff ties into the commercial products as well. So it's not like purely a, just like a thing for its own sake. Like, I think it does accelerate the development of our production apps that we have these tools that we're working on, and we're like not afraid to invest really heavily in those tools. But yeah, like right now, what I've been working on most recently is I'm kind of like the tech lead for Apollo. So back in the day when we started working on it, I kind of laid down the first lines of code and have been in general kind of like working with a bunch of different people to set the direction for the project. So that's been a lot of fun. Like, I haven't really gotten a chance to do something like that before, but like identifying kind of what I think was a pretty big need in the community, especially because there's so much demand for GraphQL, and then like figuring out the ways in which we could make it easier for people to take advantage of that was pretty much what I was working on. So that was a lot of fun.
Oh, that's awesome. That sounds like a fun jobs with you guys.
Side note is that we are hiring as well. So this is probably a good part to plug that. So if you would like a job, please email me or contact me in some way so that I can talk to you.
Are you guys hiring remotely, or do you have to be located in a certain area?
Well, actually, every single person on my team is currently remote except for me, which I guess makes me remote as well.
That definitely makes, yeah. So, that's funny.
I'm actually speaking to you guys from Melbourne, Australia, so I'm very much remote right now.
Oh, cool. Do you know Jed Watson? I know Australia is a huge place, but do you know Jed?
I do not, but I feel like I know that name.
Well, yeah, he's on our podcast. He's from Australia somewhere. I know, Australia is such a small place. Everybody kind of knows each other, but
yeah, definitely.
Cool. Peter or Ali or anybody really, is there anything else you kind of guys want to ask or go over the next couple of minutes? I think we're probably going to wrap it up in just a minute.
Oh, no. I've had all my questions answered. This was such an exciting podcast.
Yeah, man, I think I learned a lot. I mean, I really think a lot of people that I've talked to, they either know like a lot about Apollo and GraphQL enough to where they wouldn't need to listen to this, or they have been like me trying to find these answers. And, honestly, it might even be a good idea. I don't know. Maybe this is just me because I haven't looked in the right places, but to have like, some of these questions on your website somewhere, if you don't already, and kind of, go into some of this stuff because, there isn't a place to get all this information right now, in my opinion, unless I'm missing something.
I think it's really great. Like in particular, I think the questions that you guys have asked and the stuff that you found to be interesting is like a really great signal for what we should write down, because I think it really depends on the particular audience, right? Like, it's like, how much do people already know about GraphQL? How invested are people in Redux, for example, or React or React Native? People might want to know different things.
Yeah, definitely. And like where it fits in. And for me in particular, when I first started with it was like, where does it fit in? And do I need to throw out existing parts of my app to integrate this? Or is this something I can continue, my process? Like, I don't have to stall a bunch of features because I'm like rewriting a bunch of stuff. But it is actually something you can kind of just plug in and possibly, keep going on your app. You don't really have to be set back a whole lot other than kind of learning it and getting the initial project set up. You don't have to rewrite a bunch of stuff at first.
Yeah, that would be a great idea for like a blog post or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I've been actually waiting for this kind of like this type of project to come out, because I don't want to basically start everything from scratch. And I want people actually dedicated to this part of the like tooling, so I can basically learn from them. And I'm very excited. And to be honest with you, it's kind of like you're kind of like I'm planning to change my religion from REST, I guess, to GraphQL just because of Apollo. Yeah, I'm gonna give it another shot, and probably I'm gonna be the noisy guy in GitHub issue. So
thank you so much. That would be. I mean, the more issues we have, the better.
Yeah. I will keep asking you guys a question because I really want to invest into it, because I found that as soon as the number of the REST API increases, it becomes extremely difficult to maintain, and you kind of like forget what you had. And then, but with the GraphQL, everything seems like it's a promising, but the tooling is not there yet. And I guess Apollo is going to be the first one, and hopefully will be the only one that actually encourage people to start using GraphQL technology. And I will give it another shot, and I will try to implement it into our platform to see how it goes. But expect me on a GitHub issue.
Oh, sure. Well, I would say, like, hopefully not the only one, because we really want to see GraphQL become like a big thing. And if it was just us, that's, you know, unless we get really big, that's not going to be a big thing. So I think that there'll be lots of tools. But yeah, it's definitely the thing about the structured nature of GraphQL enables things like optics, which mean we can say like to you, hey, this field is not getting used in your schema. You could think about getting rid of it, or this one is slow, you know. And this is the sort of thing that's really hard to do with REST, right? You might have a certain part of your database that's getting access from various REST endpoints, and trying to figure that out sounds hard.
All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and get to the picks. Peter, do you have any picks tonight?
So speaking of server rendering and everything that we've been kind of going over, one that sort of made my life a little easier, one component was called React Resolver. If you haven't heard of it, it's a component by Eric Clemens, and what it does is it basically lets you resolve data on both the client and the server, and it hooks nicely into Redux. And it definitely made that whole process for me a little easier.
Okay. Ali, do you have any picks?
Well, I've been searching around, and then I found something pretty interesting. It's called Git SSB. Well, I've been using it like for a test, and it's pretty cool. What it does is just using a behind the scene. It's kind of like a decentralized the Git repository, even though the Git is already decentralized, but there is no. They're basically using the append only technology on a web, so you keep appending into it. I'm still learning about it, but it's based on a technology called, I can't pronounce it properly, but it's called Secure. I don't know how to pronounce it, but that's the technology behind it. And this is a pretty interesting concept that I was talking about, I guess, a couple of weeks ago, that you can basically creating a serverless. What I mean by serverless is there is no hosting or domain that you need to actually do. You're just basically publishing your website, and then nobody can actually basically sabotaging or DDoS your server, is basically because there is no server. And then you can keep publishing your content into that. And then somebody actually creates something called Git SSB, which you can basically commit your code into something that never basically being destroyed. So it's kind of like an interesting project to look into.
All right. Sashko, do you have any picks?
Well, I didn't come prepared with any, but one thing that I've been really excited about is we had a GraphQL conference recently, and there were some open source projects that presented there. And my personal favorite was this thing called Thunder, which is a GraphQL server written in Go, but one that's focused on real-time data.
Okay, awesome. Where can people go to learn more about that?
Yeah, so I've we'll put a link up, but yeah, it's just called Thunder. If you Google for like GraphQL Thunder, you'll see it.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, Tom, do you have any picks?
I guess if I'm talking GraphQL as well, it would probably be Join Monster, which is a really cool node package for like doing proper joins for your resolvers, because it's a common problem in GraphQL that you have like an n+1 problem where your resolvers all make their own queries. And Join Monster enables you to somehow magically turn that all into one query. That's really cool. And on the subject of server rendering, I also found out about Preact today. I don't know, it's the latest thing, I think. But it has support in component will mount for asynchronous functions. So it could potentially just solve the server rendering problem of like prefetching data. But anyway, haven't really looked into it yet. Have you guys heard of Preact?
Yeah, I keep hearing a lot about it. I've been wanting to look at it. So the fact that they have server rendering stuff makes me want to look at it even closer now. So what about you? Anybody else has seen it?
I could be making that up, but that was my initial thought when I saw that their example, they do an async thing in there on component will mount. My thought was, hey, that would remove the whole need for our server rendering code. So
I think there's only one drawback of pure React. They added it's fully compatible with the React schema, but they added a bunch of new API. So down the road, if you want, like if you implement the entire thing with pure React and then you wanted to go back to the React, that would be the headache, because then you have to re-implement all those the methods that are already being provided by pure React. And that's the only issue that I have with the pure React.
React as opposed to Preact.
Well, I call it a pure React. I don't know how to pronounce it, so I just simply call it that.
Okay.
Is Apollo on Twitter anywhere?
Yeah, we're on Twitter under Apollo GraphQL.
Okay, cool. Okay, well, my picks are, I have 2 picks. One of them is actually what I just had mentioned earlier. I wrote a blog post about React Native with Apollo Server. It's called React Native with Apollo Server. And then there's the second post. It's a React Native with Apollo Client. And it's specifically about React Native. At least the second post is. So if you want to learn more about it, check that out along with the other resources we mentioned. And the second pick is going to be React training. So I went to the React training by Michael Jackson and Ryan Florence, the advanced React training in Phoenix last weekend. And it was last week, actually. And it was really, really good. It was a lot better than I thought it would be. I just assumed, I've been doing this for so long and I know everything or whatever. But after going to that class, even on the first day, learned so much, just, a lot of techniques and stuff that were, I wasn't really aware of. So if you ever have the chance to go, I would definitely recommend checking it out. They have like an advanced class, but they also have a beginner class. All right. Well, Sashko and Tom, I think that wraps up episode 47. We really appreciate you guys coming on.
Thanks so much for having us.
This was such a good chat, fellas. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. We appreciate you guys coming on, and we'll hopefully have you on again in the future.
Great. Sounds great.
Sounds great.